Hey everybody, this is Jim Dewey with Combating the Narrative, and boy do I have a doozy for you guys today. So initially I was considering doing another video on the Cynical Historian because he's just got so many bad videos on his channel, but I figured, hey, variety is the spice of life, right? Let's see what else is out there in the YouTube history sphere. So I stumbled across this YouTube channel titled Atun-Shei Films. Not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it, so deal with it. And where I was mildly amused by the Cynical Historian, this guy is just straight up annoying to the point of, like, serious irritation. Ridiculous voices with straw man arguments, costumes, clickbaity titles, you name it, this guy does it, and it needs to be addressed. So the first video I'm showing you of his is called Was It Really the War of Northern Aggression? Question mark, exclamation point, etc., etc. Yes, that's how he's really got it with his punctuation and capitalization up as a YouTube video on his channel. And the funny thing about this video of his is he doesn't ever really stay on the point of whether or not it's the war of northern aggression, or in other words, was the South justified in seceding from the Union? Did they have the right to do so? He started out touching on the point of whether or not it was the war of northern aggression, but then he meanders off on this bizarre tangent about slavery and how everyone he doesn't like is literally Hitler. So I'm going to address his points on the war of northern aggression and whether or not the South had the right to secede, and I'm going to leave his other points untouched, not because I can't counter them, but because it would be extraordinarily tedious, and this video would probably become hours long, and it's not the point I'm really looking to address at this juncture. I don't like editing out parts of videos because I don't want to be accused of taking things out of context or intellectual dishonesty, but it just really was not relevant to the video as a whole, and it was I get the sense that it was supposed to be uproariously funny, but I mean, I'm just sitting here stone-faced and annoyed, so I cut it. I'm not going to make you guys suffer through it like I had to. I will, however, make you suffer through the final little skit of his, for lack of a better term, about how everyone he doesn't like and Confederate sympathizers are Nazis. That's obviously hyperbole, but only just barely. That sort of behavior cannot be tolerated and left unaddressed, unfortunately. Well, buckle up and drink up, 'cause here we go.
Why did the North invade the South in 1861? Was it because they hated slavery? No, it was to save the Union.
I will say he's got a modicum of intellectual honesty by even admitting that point, because a lot of people these days won't. They try and retcon history to fit into their own particular belief system. But yes, primarily the goal of saving the Union was the cause that Lincoln and the Northern government used to invade the South. But ask yourself, and I would like to genuinely know this guy's answer to this question, why was the Union worth saving? Why is this thing so sacrosanct that it has to be preserved for eternity? Why is this a good cause for the death of near 700,000 people? Not to mention the untold amount of economic damage the South suffered and arguably never truly recovered from. Why is this a good reason for war? And if you truly deem this to be just cause for war, this needs to be extrapolated out to the modern day. Is the EU justified in invading the British Isles because they decided to leave the EU? That's only slightly different from what was going on in the United States. The United States at the time was not much more unified than the EU is today, if one takes into account that virtually all EU member states are also in NATO. The victors write the history books, and you have to do all sorts of mental gymnastics to try and make the Union the good guys in this situation. Because the justification for war that the Union used is something that you would condemn any modern nation for using today, because it's a flimsy excuse to unleash the horrors of war.
Just because abolition wasn't a primary Northern war aim doesn't change the fact that the South unequivocally seceded to preserve slavery.
So what? Your point being? Number one, slavery was still legal, so I'm not entirely sure what you're driving at by that point. First of all, slavery has been practiced by humans in every society, including the United States, throughout all of history. This is not an evil that's unique to the Confederacy. That'd be like saying the United States had no right to secede from Great Britain because they had slaves. It's a non sequitur. Moreover, so long as the causes which impelled them to the separation are not light or transient, which the question of slavery is neither light nor transient, I don't understand why it even matters. But quite frankly, through a long train of abuses and usurpations, the government in Washington had lost the consent of the governed, and men have a right to govern themselves and be under a government which represents them and their interests, which clearly the government in Washington did not do. The writing was on the wall. The South was keenly aware that they were rapidly losing political power, and that trend was not going to change anytime soon. They were no more required to be under the yoke of other men and a foreign government than the founders of the United States or any country were obligated to.
South Carolina, for example. South Carolina seeked succession from the Union first for reasons that are debated upon. Slavery.
I mean, the idea that the cause alone of the Civil War was slavery is very reductive. Yes, you're identifying a link in the chain that led up to the Civil War in the United States, but you're not identifying that first link in the chain, which is a fundamental difference in the visions of the societies that existed in the North and South. Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian, industrial versus agrarian. It's these key differences in society that led to a majority of the disagreements in Congress that almost led up to civil war another time 30 years prior during the nullification crisis. Both sides were trying to wrest control of the federal government in order to implement policies that benefited them at the expense of the other, North and South. The question of slavery became a litmus test for your political alignment. And when you have acts like the Missouri Compromise going through Congress, which severely curtailed the ability of the South to gain or maintain any real political power, the deal is sealed. It's going to come to bloodshed. And by the time the Kansas-Nebraska Act repeals the Missouri Compromise, or rather replaces it, it's too late, and it's already come to violence, as we see in Bleeding Kansas. So is slavery a causal factor in the war? I would say yes, but is it the cause? No, I think that's an oversimplification. And historical revisionists cling and fight tooth and nail to maintain this notion that slavery caused the Civil War, because it's the only way you can mentally justify that egregious act of aggression that was the North mustering an army and sending them south.
Debated upon, what was Lincoln's reaction? Violate constitutional law and did multiple acts of war against a state that by law should have been able to succession from the Union.
That face that he's making right there is the face that I've been making the entire time during this video. I mean, first of all, congratulations. You found a really dumb YouTube comment fraught with grammatical errors. Did you really expect a doctoral dissertation from the YouTube comment section, like arguing against a straw man, or at the very least a poorly constructed argument, doesn't make you look smarter? I don't know why you would want to argue against bad arguments if you're so certain that you're correct. But yes, I don't know how you can claim that Lincoln mustering an army and sending them down south to go occupy and by force bring the South back into the fold is not a violation of the Constitution. I mean, I will read the 9th and 10th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution for you right here, right now. The 9th Amendment reads, The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The 10th Amendment reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Or, in other words, 9th Amendment says, hey, just because it's not in here doesn't mean it's not a right. And the 10th Amendment says, hey, if it's not a power specifically granted to the federal government or taken away from the states, it's a power retained by the states or the people. So it would naturally follow that the states have the right to secede. And you know as well as I do that there is no way that they would have got everybody on board for the Revolutionary War and bringing them into the United States afterward if they didn't believe they had the power to leave at any time for almost any reason.
In response to the actions of the president, which was tyrannical. Dude, South Carolina seceded before Lincoln was even inaugurated.
Again, what even is your point here? What difference does it make if they seceded before or after he was inaugurated? The writing was still on the wall. It was clear still that the South was probably never going to win another national election, and they certainly weren't going to retain any sort of power in Congress. What's the difference if they waited until after it was inaugurated instead of just elected? It's like if you see you're about to get hit by a bus, you don't have to wait until the bus actually hits you to justify getting out of the way.
Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president a full 6 days before Lincoln was.
Again, cool. Your point being, how does this make this not a war of northern aggression?
In any event, slavery was never at the forefront of the Union reason for fighting. Most Southern states and generals joined the CSA after Lincoln, without approval from Congress, raised an army of 75,000 to invade the South, which he did on April 15th, 1861, right after the attack on Fort Sumter.
Yeah, I mean, again, just because it's in a dumb YouTube comment doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong. Like, he's correct. If you think that the average northern white man was on board to go fight, kill, and die so that black slaves could be free, you're high. And yeah, Fort Sumter got fired upon. South Carolina declared itself to be a free and independent state, which it had every right to be, and they demanded that a foreign military withdraw its troops. And the state of South Carolina spent 4 months asking politely. They gave multiple opportunities for surrender. They gave multiple opportunities for peaceful withdrawal. And when they were all refused, yeah, the independent state of South Carolina fired on a foreign military that was occupying its territory. And the United States knew that this would be the inevitable conclusion if they did not withdraw from the independent territory of South Carolina. Their simply being there and occupying the territory was an act of aggression that could not be allowed to stand forever. And this is very reminiscent of what the British did after the Revolutionary War in the United States, where they refused to withdraw from their forts and outposts in sovereign American territory and abide by the treaties they signed. And this was a major cause in the War of 1812. Yeah, so an occupational force was fired upon after having been given every opportunity to leave, and it was entirely justified. Imagine for a moment you're going through a nasty divorce and, your spouse is refusing to sign the divorce papers and they're refusing to leave the house and they don't want to believe that it's all happening, and you've gone through all the due process and you've gone through the courts who have issued their instructions, and she's still refusing to abide by the court order, refusing to leave your house, your property. Eventually, somebody is going to come and use force to remove that spouse from the property because they no longer have a right to be there. That's the inevitable outcome. It is not an immoral action to use force to have them removed at that point. The same applies on the macro level when it comes to nations.
And in so doing, he alienated the 4 states that were still holding out for a compromise in the spring of '61. The North was the only party calling for troops. As Virginia Governor Fletcher said, "You have chosen to inaugurate civil war." The Southern states never had any intention of invading the North. We didn't need to.
Again, I mean, I know this is supposed to be satire, but this is a correct assessment. The South never had any designs on moving armies north in order to, put their hobnail boots on the necks of the government in Washington. That was never on the table. All they wanted was to be free and independent states and to be left alone. There's no existential threat to the United States that would justify an invasion of the South.
Do you know what the seceded states were up to for the 4 months before Fort Sumter?
Chillin', yearning for freedom from Yankee tyranny. Well,
I mean, you can mock this all you want, but you know what the South wasn't doing? Occupying Northern Territory.
not quite.
January 4th, 1861. Anticipating Alabama's immediate secession, Governor A.B. Moore ordered the state militia to seize federal property at Mount Vernon Arsenal, Fort Morgan, and Fort Gaines, effectively putting Mobile Bay in Confederate control. January 6th, a group of armed men barged into the federal arsenal at Apalachicola, Florida, and demanded the keys to the armory. January 10th, weeks before Louisiana's secession, state militia seized the U.S. arsenal at Baton Rouge on orders from the governor. The following day, they seized Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which guarded the mouth of the Mississippi. January 13th, armed Mississippians took forcible control of the unfinished federal fort on Ship Island in the Gulf. January 24th, Georgia militia seized the Augusta arsenal. February 8th, acting on orders from the governor, Arkansas militia volunteers seized the federal arsenal at Little Rock and escorted federal troops across state lines. March 6th, the Provisional Confederate Congress authorized President Davis to raise an army of 100,000 men for 12 months' service. April 12th, South Carolina militia fired on Fort Sumter. April 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months' service to suppress the rebellion. Call me crazy, but all I see is Southern aggression.
Okay, sure, you're crazy. I don't see any Southern aggression at all. You know what I do see? The South having to, by force, remove a foreign military from their own sovereign territory because that foreign military has refused to leave despite repeated attempts to get them to do so peacefully. And as far as being authorized to raise a 100,000-man army for 12 months of service, I mean, by this point in time, the blind could see that the North was not going to let the South go peaceably, and that they were going to have to be prepared to fend off a better equipped, better supplied army. I don't know how you do that without making provisions for an army. You might have a point if the Confederates at this point were, without a declaration of war, launching expeditions against, northern arsenals like Rock River or northern shipyards or, gun carriage manufacturers in the North. But no, this is all isolated within Southern territory. And I sincerely doubt they had the logistical capacity to launch expeditions north at this point in time. I mean, they certainly really didn't have an easy time doing it with their economy fully mobilized for war later on during the Civil War. There's no existential threat to the United States here. Again, full stop. Period.
You yellow-bellied horse thief! We raided those armories and forts because we needed weapons, and plenty of them, to facilitate our peaceful and equitable separation from the Union.
I mean, yes, on top of what I just said, this is not an invalid point. You have to remember that the South didn't have much of an industrial economy, at least compared to the North. They were going to have a really hard time manufacturing any sort of high volume of heavier military equipment, especially things like guns and gun carriages. Field artillery pieces, not firearms, so that would have been an issue too. And again, this is all still taking place in Southern independent territory. So I am still, however many minutes into your video, waiting for you to tell me how this isn't the war of Northern aggression and how secession wasn't justified.
Good thing we did, too, for soon after the war started, the tyrant Lincoln showed his true colors. He suspended habeas corpus illegally and jailed his political enemies without any charges. What do you call that except despotism of the highest order?
I call that pretty typical for a 19th century wartime government.
You want to know what else is pretty typical for governments and countries throughout all of human history? Slavery, the great evil which justifies your northern aggression in your mind. This is also where the video starts to kind of go off the rails, and he's very clearly not going to address the point of whether or not, northern military intervention in the South was justified. So I'm not going to show too much more of his video except for the end bit. Not because I'm afraid to argue against his points or I'm trying to hide anything, but it's just not useful to this conversation about whether or not the Civil War was justified in terms of the northern military intervention to discuss like draft riots and slavery and whatever else he wants to talk about. I mean, if he's got a cogent and coherent point he'd like to make regarding those particular subjects, I'd be happy to discuss it with him anytime, anywhere. Who knows, maybe we'd even find some common ground, but I suspect it'll be more of this, more of the same, more lies, more straw men and mockery rather than actually addressing any points. Now, I do apologize for what I'm about to show you. It's really just grotesque, obscene, and downright annoying. I've cut it down as short as I can to make the point I need to make with it. Because, again, it needs to be addressed.
And faiths. That's not a bad point. Mixed communities are a disaster. Usually it's just one community getting to the top anyway. Communities are better kept separate, or at least totally homogeneous. That way they can preserve their race, identity, and culture. If you ever noticed, mixed communities look just like New York City and have no identity. Bastardizing anything unique. Devilry! I have returned, Lord. You have brought me to the Valley of Izion, where I live in the despoty and the ice, ending by mountains of sin, I behold your glory. You have no power here, which finds a general. I will draw thee out, Satan, as poison is drawn from a wand.
If I go, Johnny Rip.
Yes. The old everyone I don't like and anyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi trope. That's real intellectual of you. Anyone who defends the Confederacy must of course be a closet Nazi. Well, let me tell you something, man. You're the one with the Wehrmacht uniform and Nazi armband. Not me. And this is the disgusting tactic used by academics and experts, in quotes, all the time. They equate any deviation from or questioning of the narrative to being a Nazi. And most probably couldn't even articulate to you what a Nazi actually is because they've been so distorted by mainstream interpretations of history to just be cartoon supervillains. It's just the equivalent of calling somebody double plus bad. And this is so dangerous because when you declare all your opponents to be double plus bad, to be a super evil cartoon supervillain, to be a Nazi, you start to justify all sorts of terrible, heinous things like censorship, like doxing, like trying to get somebody canceled or fired from work, or even violence. And that's why I, along with many others, refer to this as a blood libel. Because after all, if the ends is stopping the Nazis, whatever that nebulous term even means these days, then any and all means are justified. After all, haven't we already established that it's always okay to punch a Nazi?